I'm sharing this with you. When she first moved back to Canada to study, she was in the same city as her Auntie Sharon. Her Auntie Sharon is a big personality. And Auntie Sharon doesn't mind sharing her opinion about things, telling people how they ought to do them. She and I used to work in the kitchen together an awful lot, and we figured out our rhythm, but it took us some time. So my daughter, who is very conflict averse, was like, I don't want to spend time with Auntie Sharon. And yet Auntie Sharon had known her virtually since birth. And I kept saying, she loves you. You should spend time with her. She resisted. Okay. Then my daughter begins to volunteer at the homeless cafe. It's called the Bridgeport Cafe. And it's every, I think, Wednesday and Thursday at the church that Mike and I used to attend when we lived in our little town, our little city. So my daughter goes in to help out with this homeless ministry. And her Auntie Sharon is there because she also belongs to that church. And she watches her Auntie Sharon, who not only feeds the people, she takes their filthy clothes and she brings her sewing machine and she mends them. Those clothes don't smell very good. And she watches that her Auntie Sharon is there week after week after week. And so she's talking to me about this. And she says, I don't know what to make of this. Because Auntie Sharon is this way and she's this way. Moving over. In a class I once conducted, ruminations about this Luke text were that it is an admonishment of self-righteousness. Not that righteousness in itself is a bad thing. No, it's not. Some of the Hebrew and Greek translations for righteousness interpret it as justice. And the word justice or righteousness appears in the Bible approximately 300 times. So we could imply from this that justice is a concept that is both important to God and perhaps one that is difficult for us to grasp. In Micah, we are taught to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. But what does justice look like in the New Testament? Jesus Christ was executed by the authorities. He was an outcast. We were talking about that this morning at our Bible study at 8:45 a.m. Like our tax collector, unexalted by Roman social standards, and Jesus was of lowly birth. Although he was a Jewish teacher, often called rabbi, by his Jewish disciples. So upon much studied reflection, I have realized that I cannot condemn the Pharisee for his prayer. His prayer was a standard Jewish prayer for a male religious. Most Jewish prayers are traditionally prayers of thanks, and his was a genuine prayer, an expression of thanks. And the Pharisee was taking time to make this connection with God. To our ears, he sounds prideful and arrogant, though he was responding in the way ascribed by his religion. And he was responding to and acknowledging God's work in his life. In this parable, the Pharisee's prayer is a mirror. I should have had a mirror for us this morning, for us. It prompts our go-to instinct to judge his righteousness. His prayer also brings into focus the tax collector. And we can look through the lens of Jesus, who forgave us and who extends that forgiveness to even the tax collector. But a Jesus who also calls us forward to renew ourselves daily by acknowledging how sincerely we have been in relationship with God. Our God is a generous God, and if we hold up the mirror, we can also ask ourselves, how do I reflect that generous God? And if I don't reflect our generous God, what is the impact for my church or my community? I was talking about it with the children this morning. Being righteous is also understood as being holy. How do we share in one another's holiness and honor that? So the story I shared with you at the beginning of this sermon and the Lucan text bring to mind also Matthew 7:3. Why do you look at the speck of sawdust in your brother's eye and pay no attention to the log in your own? Again in Luke, but in chapter 6, verse 42, we find the admonition, you hypocrite, first take the plank out of your own eye, and then you will see clearly to remove the speck from your brother's eye. Tax collecting as a profession was a dirty job. Dirty as in mafia shakedown dirty. This man was not practicing Micah's exhortation of loving kindness, but by God's standards, he was justified at the moment he prayed his prayer. He clearly saw his wayward behavior, and he announced that through prayer. He removed the plank from his own eye. The Pharisee and the tax collector were connected through their need to pray. The Pharisee was following his religious laws, and our Protestant American lens makes his prayer sound definitively arrogant. But Jesus has fooled us in this parable, as Jesus generally does. We may have judged the Pharisee through our own eyes, through our own lens, in the way that we might be attaching to the Pharisee. So the way that we would listen to the Pharisee is through our own lens and not through the Pharisee's lens. We may have become the judge and jury in a situation we don't have all the information for. The prayers of the men are different in that one recognizes his unlawful acts in collecting money above the lawful stipulations. The Pharisee, by his religious belief, is abiding by his law and is practicing right relationship with God, righteousness. He is also knowledgeable about how that tax collector skims others' pockets to make a living. However, the tax collector has changed his way. He approaches God by seeing his actions through the God lens. To do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. In looking through that lens, he doesn't come out very well. He has been unjust in his actions towards others. So he feels compelled to confess this. The Pharisee will continue to be law-abiding according to his religious customs. And I believe Jesus was not actually calling the Pharisee unjustified. Instead, the Pharisee is the foil in the parable, exposing our tendency to judge. So, it's not what we think. The Pharisee is not actually arrogant. He is practicing his law. He is being faithful. But we are looking at it from an angle where we didn't have all of the information. Only God has that. Now, when we see the Pharisee through new eyes, he's only praying the prayer expected of him. He's not the villain we may have initially suspected he was. We were judging him by our own standards. And Jesus is making the point that judging by comparison is self-righteousness. Remember that the story begins, are you listening? He told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and regarded others with contempt. It's a parable for us and about us. So my daughter and I shared an aha moment when she declared that she just didn't know what to think, didn't know where to place her Auntie Sharon. According to how she saw her, nothing seemed to fit. And that aha came when she exposed the truth with those words that she couldn't find a place to put her. That's because it's not actually our job to judge. That job belongs solely, no pun intended, to God. This is the message of the Luke passage. The good news is that God knows our hearts. He so loves us, he came to earth to experience being through Jesus. He knows too the heart of the Pharisee. Christ suffered excruciating injustices for holding up a mirror, didn't he? And maybe our Pharisee has suffered in our parable for holding up our mirror. We have not recognized his place, his value in this story of God. We know how to practice right relationship because we are continually offered God's ample grace when he witnessed to us in the flesh, calling us back to him. He asks us to pray, and in our prayer to experience a change of heart, to remove the plank. When we are forgetting to recognize our humanity as sisters and brothers, and how to recognize that humanity in others. God welcomes us home each time we reach out to him, and each time we perform this through sincere prayer. God justifies us because we are important to God. In God's response, we are exalted, lovingly lifted up as a child returning home. He has written it on our hearts. We are precious to him. And our response is to remember it of one another, like my daughter did for her Auntie Sharon. Amen.